To say that the Marvel Cinematic Universe has been a success would arguably be as much of an understatement as saying that the Catholic Church has a little bit of a pedophilia problem. Over the last 15 years, audiences have been treated to compelling characters and intriguing story arcs that were bolstered through the successful establishment of a broader cinematic universe, bringing joy and excitement to fans and billions of dollars to Disney via Marvel Studios. The successful creation of a shared universe where various heroes and villains coexist over the course of multiple films allowed for the writers to use a wide variety of creative character interactions and situational plot devices, which would normally seem anywhere from rushed to completely nonsensical in a standalone movie. And with relentless planning and foresight from the studio and filmmakers through the development of the earlier phases, they were surprisingly able to maintain general coherence throughout the overall narrative. The end result of this multi year effort was some of the most successful and highest grossing movies of all time, effectively establishing Disney as the powerhouse of the film industry. And with all that money and power, Disney seems to be exemplifying the historical theory that absolute power corrupts absolutely, as they begin to tread down the path of Icarus, tripping over their own feet throughout phases 4 and 5 as they fly closer to the sun in their relentless pursuit of profits. But despite where the MCU goes from here, the success of the first three phases has had and will continue to have a significant impact on the world of filmmaking, may that be for the better or for the worse. While still giving the deserved credit to films like the Avengers series, which ultimately cemented the greater legacy of the MCU amongst their many other successful titles, there's a film which isn't praised nearly enough for its role in establishing this modern cinematic universe of heroes. A film that's initial popularity spawned its own financially successful trilogy, which effectively paved the way for the creation of the modern MCU. A film that, despite being released back in 1998, featured a titular character who is still highly recognizable to this day, partially because he was so badass that he reverse influenced his comic book inspiration to the point that Marvel Comics adapted his live action character design into their comics and continues to use it to this day. That film, of course, is Blade, featuring a perfectly cast Wesley Snipes as the Daywalker, a half human, half vampire hybrid on a relentless mission to eradicate a vampire underworld that lurks within the shadows of society while battling his own personal demons. It was the first successful live action adaptation of a Marvel Comics character, ultimately demonstrating to them the inherent potential of utilizing their less popular comic characters in big budget films and instilling in them the confidence needed to successfully launch their own cinematic universe in the ensuing years. In order to speak to Blade's overall impact on the future of not just the MCU, but arguably the entire genre of superhero movies, I'd like to first explore the history of Marvel Studios and Marvel films in general, and then discuss the overall reception towards Blade, as it was a relatively groundbreaking movie at the time in terms of its concept. Throughout the 1990s, Marvel Studios was on the verge of bankruptcy, and in a time of desperation cut several deals to effectively sell off the film rights to many of their most beloved characters for a relative bargain. While their biggest names like Spider Man and the X Men were scooped up by Sony and 20th Century Fox, the character rights for Blade ended up in the hands of New Line Cinema. It isn't unreasonable to assume that this could very well have been the ideal landing spot for a dark and gritty character like Blade, as New Line Cinema was able to wet their feet in the live action anti hero genre with Spawn in 1997, which, despite being decimated by critics, went on to make a modest profit at the box office, and perhaps they were able to apply some lessons learned from Spawn to the production of Blade. Despite initially struggling to come to an agreement on the creative direction and overall tone for the titular character, the studio was able to debut their new ass kicking vampire slayer on the big screen in 1998, achieving the first official commercial success for a Marvel comic character in live action. The success of the film and overall popularity of the character resulted in two subsequent sequels, and despite mixed reactions from critics and an overambitious third installment that saw a sharp reduction in quality compared to Guillermo del Toro's previous, more horror centric sequel, the trilogy was a financial success, with each film bringing in 2 to 3 times its production budget at the box office. While the Spider Man and X Men trilogies ultimately went on to generate significantly more box office income on higher production budgets than the Blade films, and you can spend all day comparing the inherent qualities of the three respective trilogies. The fact that Blade is even able to share the stage with the other two was an eye opening revelation for Marvel Studios. If you went back in time to the early 1990s and told a Marvel executive that within 10 years, their largest intellectual properties in the world of cinema would be Spider Man, the X Men, and Blade, I have a hard time imagining they would not burst out laughing. What the box office success of Blade essentially accomplished was that first it made it very evident to Marvel executives that there was clear big screen potential in even their less popular comic book characters. Secondly, I'm sure they realized that selling off their best IPs for next to nothing and allowing competing studios to rake in millions of dollars while they get a measly cut of the profits might not have been the best move for them in hindsight, which would only become clearer after the success of the X Men and Spider Man trilogies as well. To add insult to injury, films like Ang Lee's Hulk, Fox's two initial Fantastic Four movies, Daredevil with Ben Affleck, and even The Punisher with Thomas Jane managed to turn a profit despite the reactions being anywhere from mixed to downright dreadful. Fortunately for Marvel Studios, the modest income they were able to generate through these licensing deals allowed them to stay afloat and bide their time like a true supervillain lurking in the shadows, focusing on other revenue streams in the interim years as they prepared and built themselves up for their inevitable and crushing revenge arc on an industry collectively reaping everything they had inherently sowed. With this newfound appreciation and dedication to their characters, Marvel was not going to make the same mistake to squander them as they did previously. And in 2005, the floodgates opened as their contracts with various studios began to expire, seeing their now highly valued heroes start to finally return back home. By 2006, Marvel had regained the rights to Iron Man, Thor, Black Panther, Black Widow, and the Incredible Hulk, albeit on complicated terms with Universal. The studio was able to successfully pitch and receive financing for a series of self-funded movies with their own creative direction, and the vision really started to take shape when Kevin Feige entered the picture in 2007, bringing with him his past experience working on many of Marvel's biggest licensed products and the dream of developing a broader, interconnected world of superheroes on the big screen. In 2008, Iron Man was released to critical acclaim and great financial success, officially kickstarting the MCU prior to Disney sweeping in the following year to acquire Marvel Studios, intent on making it a key component of their brand because of the potential that they saw in it.
Hello, I like money.
While the acquisition by Disney effectively established Marvel Studios as a top-tier player in the film industry, something still impressive about the story of the MCU is how they were able to leverage their less popular comic characters to effectively establish their cinematic universe. In the earlier days of the MCU, Marvel was forced to lean into their B-list comic characters, as their most popular properties were still out of reach to them in the hands of studios like Sony and Fox. But given the success and popularity of a film like Blade, Marvel had a perfect example of how the effective utilization of a comic book character in a live-action movie can fundamentally appeal to a significantly broader audience than you would expect purely based on the popularity of the comic book counterpart. In the early phases, Marvel Studios took great care to ensure that these characters were given a proper treatment with compelling development arcs and exciting individual journeys. By striking a healthy balance between broader creative ambition and sheer attention to detail, they were able to write these characters in a way that they could not only coexist in a singular universe, but inevitably overlap and interact with each other to better showcase their personalities and further their development arcs. At the time, the idea of a shared universe wasn't that novel of a concept, but the inherent quality in the execution of the MCU, combined with the pace that the studio was able to maintain in their release schedule, resulted in a massive profit boost for Disney via Marvel Studios, solidifying them as the powerhouse of the film industry. And with all this money and power generated from the initial success of the MCU, it didn't take long for Disney to start to flex its newfound muscles, first entering into negotiations with Sony, who agreed to allow Spider-Man into the MCU essentially in return for a cut of the action.
What inspired you to build a second Krusty Krab right next door to the original?
Money.
This was followed by the acquisition of 20th Century Fox, and while the X-Men and Fantastic Four film rights were a relatively minor aspect of the overall deal, The fact that they were able to reacquire their own character rights by buying the entire company that they initially sold them to is pretty comical in hindsight. You have to give credit to Marvel Studios in how they utilized their B-list comic characters so effectively in comparison to the rival studios who had the rights to their A-listers, that they outperformed them to the point that they could actually bully their most inherently profitable properties back into their own hands like they were simply taking a kid's lunch money. But at the end of the day, the ultimate credit goes to Blade, a film that paved the way for the B-list comic book character and inadvertently made everything possible for Marvel Studios in the first place. Beyond simply opening the doors for Marvel Studios' comeback, Blade indirectly provided a basic prototype for the various films in the early phases of the MCU. While Blade by no means is a cinematic masterpiece, the more successful aspects of the film provided future Marvel Studios with several relevant lessons in how to properly execute a live-action superhero film. Among these, one of the most important lessons learned from the release of Blade was the importance of casting, especially in the leading role. While it is not impossible to create a high-quality superhero movie featuring a big-name ensemble cast, which will surely help in marketing and promoting the film to the average, less comic-savvy viewer, you can make the argument that in adapting superheroes to live action, there's greater importance in casting an actor who is able to thrive in their role to the point of creating an actual believable character. Blade, of course, was portrayed by Wesley Snipes, whose charismatic swagger and intimidating presence brought the character to life in a way that few people were expecting. His extensive training in various forms of martial arts like Shotokan karate, capoeira, jiu-jitsu, and kickboxing was put on full display in the over-the-top fight sequences. His skill set enabled him to perform most of his own stunts throughout the production, which resulted in splashy action sequences that were as visually impressive as they were thrilling. Snipes' natural ability to physically and emotionally embody the character of Blade resulted in a compelling hero that as a viewer you really want to root for and see them succeed regardless of how or how little you might relate to them as a person. If you have a fictional character that's difficult for viewers to relate to, then it is increasingly important to be able to generate a level of investment from the audience through other means like admiration or sympathy, and that is something that Blade did incredibly well. Through the combination of Snipes' performance, incredible costume and prop design, and an interesting new take on the character, Blade made such a significant impact that Marvel Comics fundamentally adapted the cinematic version of the character into their comic books in order to channel his newfound popularity. At this point in time, it was relatively unprecedented for a live-action comic book adaptation to achieve success to the point that it reverse-influenced its source material, with the closest thing probably being Batman the Animated Series and its associated movies, and this speaks to the broader impact of Blade on the overall superhero genre. Now, to be clear, I am certainly not saying that the casting of Wesley Snipes as Blade was directly responsible for Robert Downey Jr. being cast as Iron Man, for example, as there's far more to that story than a simple cause and effect. But with that being said, it's worth comparing the two castings in terms of what the respective actors bring to their roles and the resulting popularity and success of their characters. It is almost undeniable that Marvel Studios hit an absolute home run when they cast Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark. Much like Blade, Tony Stark's Iron Man was historically a less popular Marvel comic character, but they now had the actor with the charisma, wittiness, and inherent talents needed not just to portray Tony Stark in live action, but thrive in the role and elevate the character to the point that they can captivate a greater audience. And what they ultimately got must have exceeded their wildest dreams, as Robert Downey Jr.'s Tony Stark propelled Marvel Studios through their initial phases and was instrumental in launching the Avengers, one of the most profitable sagas in cinematic history, while simultaneously becoming one of the most beloved characters in the history of modern cinema. Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man and Wesley Snipes as Blade are two examples of what incredible casting can achieve in live-action comic book adaptations. While their characters may be dramatically different, one thing that they have in common is that their backgrounds and experiences can be fundamentally difficult for the average viewer to relate to. One is an incredibly wealthy and highly intelligent businessman and inventor, while the other is a half-human, half-vampire hybrid whose life is devoted to hunting and killing vampires. Given that the typical person won't organically relate to these types of characters, it's important that they are portrayed with a degree of likability and personality traits that are interesting and appealing to a broader group of people apart from just comic book fans. If a viewer is unable to relate to a character, then they at least have to be able to admire their underlying qualities or sympathize with them enough to become invested in their journey. What Robert Downey Jr. and Wesley Snipes brought to their respective roles were the inherent talents and skills needed to bring their characters to life on the big screen and effectively elevate them beyond what viewers were ever expecting to see. What this ultimately achieved was the creation of superhero adaptations that were almost effortlessly popular, even among the broader audiences that were less familiar with the comic book source material. Another important lesson from Blade, which albeit was more of a general message to superhero movies in general as opposed to just the MCU, but nonetheless, was that by playing into the inherent strengths of the comic book characters being adapted, in terms of their development arcs and the tone of their respective stories, you can effectively push the boundaries of a superhero film to achieve financial success. As opposed to a colorful, uplifting story that one might expect from a superhero movie, Blade was a gritty, R-rated, genre-bending action horror film set in a dark and unforgiving world. From the very first sequence, the tone is established when Blade makes a surprise appearance at an underground vampire blood rave. His arrival at the club and immediate recognition causes the vampires to panic and attack him, demonstrating his character's reputation as somebody not just hated, but truly feared by this vampire underworld. To the dismay of the vampires, they are brutally slaughtered by Blade, who almost gleefully unleashes his violent skill set and arsenal of weapons in an incredible and well-choreographed action scene, which subtly builds on the character's motivations while kickstarting the plot of the movie. For one of the earlier live-action comic book adaptations, the decision to make a dark, R-rated film that couldn't be marketed towards children like a more traditional superhero could have been considered a bold decision at the time. Spawn, another live-action product of New Line Cinema, had recently been met with poor reception while making only a modest profit at the box office. Not too long before, Tim Burton's Batman movies featuring a dark interpretation of Gotham City had been relatively well received, but their PG-13 ratings and ability to appeal to a younger audience created merchandising opportunities, making the funding of the productions less risky and more lucrative. But Blade did not hold back, as it leaned into its R-rated anti-hero narrative with everything it had, playing into the strengths of its cast and executing a film with brutally violent, high-intensity action sequences met with horror undertones, plenty of blood and gore, and compelling characters to follow throughout the story. Its success demonstrated that a darker superhero film marketed specifically for adults is not only something that is financially viable, but highly rewarding if it's done effectively and plays into its own strengths. As I mentioned earlier, Blade is by no means a cinematic masterpiece, but its success and overall impact demonstrate that its weaknesses were overshadowed by its strengths. By playing into what it did best, doubling down on the gritty characters, darker undertones, and violent action sequences, Blade ensured that the aspects of the film that were executed effectively far outweighed the lesser aspects of the film, like its plot or writing at certain times. The success of Blade, in spite of its R rating, demonstrated that you can successfully push the boundaries of a superhero movie by exploring less traditional concepts and stories that may at first appear somewhat niche. It showcased the potential demand for darker and more violent superhero content in live action, if it is properly executed. And while there is yet to be an R-rated film set in the MCU, it effectively paved the way for their Netflix shows like Daredevil, for example, which could very well be considered the very best Marvel Studios production to date. Beyond just Marvel Studios, Blade also laid the foundations for other darker comic book adaptations in film like Watchmen, Logan, Deadpool, as well as TV shows like The Boys and Peacemaker. With the impending release of Deadpool 3, it will be interesting to see how Marvel approaches their first R-rated MCU film, especially with the precedent of characters like Deadpool and Wolverine being used so effectively in their own R-rated films under 20th Century Fox. Perhaps it'll provide some insight into how they might approach their rebooted Blade. But regardless, The success of the MCU as a whole is unmatched in terms of live action comic book adaptations, and as a result, it has had a substantial impact on the superhero movie genre. It will go down in history as one of the biggest game changers in not only the adaptation of comic books to live action, but quite possibly all of modern filmmaking. But all of this begs the question, if it wasn't for Blade, what would have ultimately become of the MCU? Would it be at all recognizable to what we have seen over the years? Would it be radically different? Or would it cease to exist in its entirety? Blade not only demonstrated the inherent potential of adapting Marvel's less popular comic characters to live action, but also how it is possible to establish them in a way that they are highly compelling. Characters that can appeal to a broader audience through quality casting and proper utilization within narratives that tonally play towards their inherent strengths. By adhering to these fundamental principles, it helps to ensure a fundamental degree of quality and audience appeal in the storytelling, and empowers the writers and directors behind the movies to really push the boundaries of the genre. With the steep decline in quality of Marvel Studios' productions in the later phases of the MCU, the argument could be made that Marvel would actually benefit from reverting back to this initial strategy, as they seem to be somewhat losing their identity as they stray farther and farther away from the tactics that once formed the groundwork for their biggest successes. But at the end of the day, this appears unlikely to happen as they seem to be pretty committed to their current trajectory. But if you're anything like me, and you're struggling to make sense of the broader direction and execution strategy of the MCU at this point, then I will leave you with one final lesson from Blade himself, which might just perfectly summarize the present state of Disney's Marvel Studios.
Some motherfuckers are always trying to ice skate uphill.
Thank you very much for watching, and I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you agree, disagree, or have anything to contribute to the conversation, feel free to throw something in the comments, as you can never have too many perspectives on the subject. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.